more kind of traditional leftist sense, it would mean seizing the state, which I don't think is what you're.
Well, I would also say that
utopia is not necessarily about that.
Right. I mean, I don't think we should seize the state power so that we can use the state power ourselves. I think we need to have an alternate way of doing things. But also, this movement to where the urban masses get together, it's not something that started in the 18th or 19th or 17th century. When I was doing research about Nepal, they had stuff going back to the 1500s. I was just reading some Plutarch for class, and during the Peloponnesian War, the Spartan army was doing all this ridiculous amount of destruction to the Athenian army. But what made Pericles fall was he had to have all of the Athenian citizens go inside the city walls, which point they all became very sick, and they had a movement, and they got rid of Pericles. So this is a very long tradition, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
I was reading a journal article recently, and there was a quote in it, and somewhere I couldn't find who it was attributed to, but the quote was talking, and this is despite my use of various forms of technology, but it was talking about how in present day, and I think the quote was from like 1990, so it's not even present day anymore, but in present day, if I can watch, if I can watch large political actions from the sanctity of my house and my TV, if I can have databases about myself be kept off site away from me that I never know about, if all of these things can happen, how does that affect kind of the positioning of the self? And the quote went on to say that actually it broke your self-hood up and made it abstract and spread it around in a way that you wouldn't be able to really conceive of it anymore, but it just was this abstract thing. And for me, I've always been a very big proponent of the non-demand, but for me that was an issue of rhetoric or language that it was asked or demanded of Occupy that it provide demands, and I actually had been interviewed about this many times, and I think that it's not that we didn't want to supply various demands, it's that there's a problem with the word demand, and if you kind of replace it with a word like imperative, then I think many groups are happy to tell you that within Occupy there are very specific imperatives that can kind of help ground where people are trying to focus, and whether it's the sustainability group or the alternative currency group or all of the different groups, they had very specific things, and if you ask me, I'm not, I wasn't, I'd always be well, I'm not, I don't know that much about that. You'd have to defer to those people, and I trust them because they're a part of this thing that I'm doing, for the most part. I mean, obviously that was imperfect, but that was kind of a grounding force in the lack of demand. Because I think the problem with demand was that people had this feeling that if we enumerated demands, that if they could be placated or met, then that would somehow discredit the movement.
I guess I'm not exactly sure if, I think with a lot of the movements of the past, they only really seem to have all been working for this one clear goal in hindsight. I feel like in many of them there was as much debate and differing of directions and stuff like that at the time, and I'm not sure if you ask people from different groups involved with the civil rights movement or involved with the feminist movement, what is your goal? I'm not sure if they all would have said anything similar to each other, especially when you make this distinction between medium-term goals of ending Jim Crow and then longer-term goals where within the civil rights movement varied a lot. And then I also think that just in the situation that we're in right now, what it means to have a goal is different. I feel say during the Vietnam War, it was very easy to be we're against Vietnam and this is everything that unites us. And then when organizing against neoliberalism or finance capitalism or capital as such, it's very hard to have this just one thing that everyone is for. So I think that's just kind of the nature of where we're at right now. I think that kind of tension was mediated in the ultra-globalization movement by saying that we're a movement of movements. I think that kind of makes sense in a certain way, but I think the bigger question of was or is Occupy a movement, or is that the best language to think about it? I I'm still not sure about. I'm not sure if it's better to use like this language of rupture or uprising or like cycle of struggles. So I guess the best I can offer is not knowing.
Dave, you wanted to?
Okay.
Yeah.
I kind of think that saying Occupy Wall Street, just that name implies something, and then all these other things can come under it. And I think it's still kind of a mookier that we need. And I think it's still one that, it's interesting that you said Occupy was a tactic, because I remember before Occupy Wall Street, the only people saying Occupy were anarchists who were saying it in terms of a tactic. So, the state came down, they've made it impossible, any kind of reoccupation attempt has been suppressed and broken up, so we need new ideas and new methods, but I think like kind of the zeitgeist around Occupy Wall Street is still good, so it's like, how do we move forward? Like, I obviously think like a massive, worker organization is one way to do it, but I don't want to be so bold or non-inclusive to think that that's the only way. I think there's like a plethora of ways, but I do hope it can hang together in the way that Occupy Wall Street did, and I hope that that's still Occupy Wall Street as that idea, of what it was about can still be like carried on because it was such a successful tactic without, occupying, because we found that, no one's going to let us do that anymore.
There was I'm sorry.
Oh, it's there.
Go.
I just wanted to add something to that. I think that the lack of having demands was a direct result of the democratic process. The participatory structure we had set up wouldn't have survived if there had been demands or goals articulated. Like in a good way, that was opening up a space of limitless potential, but in a bad way, it delegated the responsibility of the individual to the group. So it was always possible to keep putting off these objectives and these conversations.
Okay. In the second row, you've had a question for a long time. Yeah.
Well, my question is, in regards to such case studies as Ash's conformity experiment or other established statistically significant prevalences of the groupthink phenomenon and other such related instances, how would you defend a direct representative meritocratist democracy as was practiced during Occupy Wall Street as a valid means of reaching consensus in a group?
I hope this addresses your question. Like I said before, I recently took part in the participatory budgeting in Brooklyn, and there was no twinkling of fingers. And instead of like being super duper aware of what everyone was thinking at every single moment, someone would propose something and you would actually get to think about it yourself. And I thought that was really awesome. And all of the votes ended up being like way closer. Almost all of the votes I saw at Occupy Wall Street, it was just like 100 to 1. I remember like literally the one vote that I took part in the first 2 months. I was literally the only person who bothered like voting no. So I think that this like hyper awareness of what everybody is thinking at every single second of the day is extremely bad for the intellectual process.
Perfectly answered, I think.
Well, I want to give. Can we get him? Thank you. Last question.
I was around for some of the 1960s stuff, obviously a different generation. But I remember thinking at that time that trying to come up with a metaphor for what the movement was like, and I kind of finally settled on the idea of a bus. The movement was like a bus, and people got on, and you were on it for a while, and it was very exciting to be with everybody going in the same direction, and work, this sense of togetherness, that we're all, working for the same thing. And after a while, you'd find you didn't completely agree with some of the people, and actually it was kind of annoying to be with them, and then you kind of got sick of it, and you realized, do I really want to be going direction? And eventually you got off the bus, and people got on, but the movement was a bus, and the thing is, it took you someplace. It really transformed people's lives. I knew a lot of people who just became complete, and it was, mostly for the good, sometimes for the bad, but mostly for the good. So how well does that metaphor fit the current Occupy Wall Street?
I don't think, maybe for some people it did. The thing about a bus is that it's like a confined space. It's going in one direction, and so everybody kind of has to shut up and go in that direction because they want, everybody could start out from different places, but, they all want to be, going in the same direction. But with Occupy Wall Street, there was this kind of, really reckless pluralism that allowed everybody to go in completely different directions, and it wasn't autonomy. It was really just a fear of confrontation, I think, and a fear of confrontation, and a fear of testing one's ideas against another's ideas. But I think, for many that, the bus metaphor might apply. I think for many of the affinity groups, or the groups that started branching out early on.
Any other responses?
Oh, there.
Could it be like a couple of buses? Maybe 10 going in different directions, or motorcycles, or maybe the motorcycles, maybe cars. I don't know. Something, nothing that's gonna smash into each other. Bumper cars, possibly. That's it.
My friend from Occupy Austin that used to live in Olympia the same time I did, we were involved with a lot of the same projects. Kind of after, he was in town on May Day, and he had this really great metaphor of the Ouija board, and he said that kind of like these spontaneous uprisings like Occupy, it's kind of like a Ouija board, but with 100,000 hands all on the little thing, and so you get to push as hard as you can with your one little hand out of the many people, but you don't really know where it's going to end up, and you can kind of make your fraction of a contribution, but it's I guess it's kind of just up to the collective zeitgeist or however things end up playing out.
I think as far as the democratic process went, I think that Zuccotti Park both looked and felt more like a pit. You would descend into it, and nothing would happen, and everyone would get really frustrated, and then at some point you're like, all right, I'm just going to get out of this pit. And I think because of that, the marching was the bus, and I think that totally transformed people's lives, and all my friends and coworkers loved getting arrested. And I think it was because the democratic process was going nowhere that people were just like, all right, we got to go somewhere. Let's go march again. I'm really obsessed with the democratic process, and I have a lot of friends who are really into Occupy Wall Street, and at some point they're just like, why do you keep on talking about that? That's not what it was about. It was about going and fighting with the cops and getting arrested and having a fun time after work, or instead of doing work.
I think with that, we might just close the panel.
I think there was a question.
Sure.
Yes, go.
Thank you. Hello. So my question is this, right? So when I first showed up to Zuccotti, right, and I would look around and all I saw were like young, like college-y white students and stuff, and I didn't feel connected. Like I didn't feel like I was accepted. I didn't feel like I belonged and/or that I could relate. What do you feel, or what do you think was the major reason why Occupy wasn't able to sort of like reach out to people of color, and how you go, and going forward, how do you address these issues, and what do we do to bring more people of color into the mix, and so yeah, that's my question.
I remember like exactly what you're talking about. In the first weekend, that was actually when, after the media blackout ended, that was actually like the first question that any media source outlet had. Like what, like look around, like what does it look like? It's a bunch of white people. I also, I mean, I don't think that they were quite as young, because what I saw was that like, I was like one of the youngest people at the park for a long time, because college age kids couldn't actually come because they were like didn't feel safe enough to leave like their class or to take off from school. No one from my school came at all. It was actually like kind of like the median age was kind of like 27 to like 40. But I think part of that might have been that like the initial call to action was like made to like almost a very specific demographic that would have like reached kind of that like Adbusters thing. 'Cause I didn't even hear about it from like Adbusters. I heard about it from someone else who like read like Adbusters and who was in the know enough to be in that clique that was organizing the Tompkins Square Park in the beginning. And maybe part of it is that I think I don't know if you were here when he was talking about like when they were organizing. Your group had this intention of being this large thing across the whole country, and it didn't end up that way. And this was kind of the converse, where it's like when people were organizing in Tompkins, I don't think they at all expected the number of people that came out. And so with that in mind, they didn't outreach to the appropriate communities. They didn't outreach to local communities. They didn't try and get like people of color in on this from the get-go. And so they weren't there. And then I think after that point, I remember the Troy Davis March, and I remember the people who started it, and they were like locals who had like a lot invested in it, and I also remember like their march kind of being co-opted by like the people from the park, and like it being like a really distinct moment of like this is gonna be like a long conversation, and not one that people I think in the moment were willing to address, because most people were so caught up in like the successes or like the winning side of it. Like, we're doing all this stuff. We can talk about like race, gender, class issues later. We're accomplishing all this stuff, and I think that was just a misdirection of energy.
Okay, we do have to end now. I want to invite everyone once again to our coffee breaks and to our reading group. I mean, for me, this panel, this particular conversation has raised a lot more questions about Occupy, and I hope that all of you will come join us for our reading groups and for the coffee breaks as well. Check out the flyers, which have locations and times, and let's please give all our panelists a big round of applause.
We have free copies of the Debt Resisters Manual right over there. It's a book about how to fight against debt, and it's free, so check it out. Are you guys gonna vote?
I'm about to collect this party.
You don't have to tell me.